Hello everyone, and welcome to my channel. Here, I mainly post reviews on literature and books, though I may gradually create content related to music and films as well. 10 years ago, I was a high school student. Since my school was a public school, I did not have a lot of extracurricular activities. Therefore, I had a lot of free time to spare. For a while, I had the desire to read literary classics in their original languages, and Russia having produced great authors, I thus decided to learn Russian on my own. Very soon, I fell in love with the language and the sensibility, humanity, and depth of its literature. In the span of 3 to 4 years, and before I turned 20, I have already read the major works of Russian literature. At the time I was 18, I wrote a blog that introduced some of the greatest Russian authors and my impressions after reading their works. Since I was still quite young at the time, my text may present some inaccuracies in terms of interpretation and analysis. My text also contains my impressions on the way these writers employed Russian vocabulary, grammar, and syntax. Now, I present you the original text, dated from nearly 10 years ago, with only minor recent touch-ups. I present the writers in chronological order according to the years in which they were active. A brief overview of some of the great Russian writers and their style. Most of the time behind in the field of technological and cultural innovations, Russia nevertheless gained prestige through the means of Peter the Great in the 17th century, who introduced many French customs to his country. By the 19th century, a literary explosion occurred, and the country of the two-headed eagle produced great writers that are still widely loved by people around the world. Russia followed roughly the same literary stylistic currents as the rest of Europe, from Romanticism with Pushkin and Turgenev as its forerunners, to realism with Tolstoy, Chekhov, Pasternak, and Solzhenitsyn at its head. However, Russian literature centers much more on the condition of the human being than countries like France, England, or Germany. Alexander Pushkin, romantic and forever young. Pushkin was first and foremost a poet, but he also wrote novels, prose, and plays. He is well known for his novel in verse Eugene Onegin and stories featuring historical figures such as Pugachev and Peter the Great. While reading his works, I was very impressed by his description of Russian landscapes as well as his knowledge of ancient mythology. In Eugene Onegin, Pushkin depicted a free spirit common to most young people through his description of balls, Russian cities, and nature. At the same time, he showed off his talent as a writer, so remarkable for his young age, by inserting French and English words from place to place. His style reminds me that of the great Chinese poet Li Po in his younger and drunken years. Nevertheless, it was unfortunate to see Pushkin's potential stop to develop abruptly when he was killed in a duel at the age of 37. Nikolai Gogol, magical realism and satire. One day, Gogol burnt part of his novel and quote, Dead Souls and quote, in a fit of rage, leaving this masterpiece forever incomplete. However, before I began to tackle this classic, I read some of his shorter novels such as The Nose and The Overcoat and Gogol often sets governmental employees as heroes to criticize Russian society and, like Marcel Proust, was a specialist in writing paragraphs that can last up to 10 pages. Yet, with a bit of patience, readers can figure out the meaning of his sentences. Moreover, as a resident of St. Petersburg, most of his stories are set in the Venice of the North. Ivan Turgenev, a very Russian cosmopolitan filled with nostalgia. Turgenev, like Pushkin, is a romantic. However, there are some differences between them. For example, Turgenev was never killed at a young age. He lived up to his 60s, but most of his novels often portrays young men in search of love and the meaning of life. The most interesting thing about some of these characters is that their stories were told by themselves, many years later, when they were already in their 40s and 50s. Another theme that Turgenev cherished is the everyday life in Russian countryside, when he unveiled us the different values of landlords and peasants through their dialogues. His landmark novel, and Fathers and Sons and features young men and is set in the countryside, and relates the ideological clash between their generation and that of their fathers. I have to remind here that Turgenev is better known in the rest of Europe than in Russia, and he traveled a lot before passing away in France. Leo Tolstoy, the aristocrat who led a humble life. Tolstoy, according to me, is one of the greatest humanists of Russia, if not to say of the world. His whole body of work is in fact his attempt at understanding the condition of humankind. In Anna Karenina and War and Peace and the two famous novels with which he gained eternal fame, Tolstoy sets respectively Levin for the former and Count Bezukov for the latter, as his alter ego, reflecting upon the place of humankind in history that will remain forever unresolved. Being himself a count, Tolstoy received a good education which permitted him to know French fluently, a factor that made War and Peace very easy for me to read vocabulary-wise, especially the chapters that feature nobility. 10% of its content were written in the language of Molière. Nevertheless, code switching is also very frequent since Tolstoy reserved parts of his novels for dialogues with peasants, which is written in an informal register which is harder to understand. Anton Chekhov, a man dedicated to realism. Often associated with 19th century realism, Chekhov is by far my favorite Russian writer of all time. He left no novel, but his hundreds of short stories and plays summarize perfectly the characteristics and emotions of human beings. For that, I qualify him as the Russian Balzac. His body of works, in addition to its diversity, also reflects his mental evolution as he ages. His first short story, written at the age of 20, contains a single paragraph which lasts 4 pages. It is constituted of long sentences that display his scientific knowledge. I reread it several times without figuring out anything. At that time, was only a naive young lad showing off his limited knowledge. His last story, on the contrary, is memorable to me because it is the first time when I understood entirely a Russian original text without the aid of a dictionary or translation. Here, Chekhov has gotten older in years, used less complicated words but expressed deeper philosophical meanings. A shade of melancholy is very evident in Chekhov's last short stories and plays, and he finally declared that life is not as easy as we may think. Maxim Gorky, a writer of the Revolution years. Gorky is one of the rare writers who actually supported the Soviet regime. His landmark novel and The Mother and relating the story of a mother supporting her socialist son. Once again, Gorky applied the principles of realism and humanism proper to Russian literature. Furthermore, his name, which is in fact a pseudonym, is not adopted randomly, since it means bitter and in Russian, an adjective that perfectly characterizes the times around the Bolshevik Revolution. Beside this novel, Gorky wrote stories and plays which depicts ways of life in different regions of the large Russia during his travels. Boris Pasternak, The Legacy of Tolstoy, winner in 1958 of the Nobel Prize of Literature that the government made him to decline. Pasternak follows on the steps of Tolstoy in his only novel, Dr. Zhivago. My high school history teacher qualified it as an quote, Les Miserables of Russia and quote, but I would rather describe it as the quote, War and Peace of the 20th century and quote, as I denoted some similarities between these large-scale novels. Indeed, both novels are set in a time of instability, the first during the Napoleonic Wars, the second during the Russian Revolution. They both abound in philosophical remarks about the human condition. The number of characters in these two classics were numerous, and I cannot always remember who is who. Moreover, Pasternak referred many times to Tolstoy and his War and Peace in his novel. Nevertheless, Dr. Zhivago is harder to understand, does not code switch between registers, and only concentrates on the life of middle-class people. Alexander Solzhenitsyn, Life in Prison Camps. By far the hardest author to understand. In terms of vocabulary, in my opinion, Solzhenitsyn nevertheless remains as one of the greatest Russian writers, not only because he won a Nobel Prize, but because he dared to tell the truth about the communist regime. His novels such as quote, One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich quote, In the First Circle quote, quote, The Gulag Archipelago quote, give us a clear insight of the horrible conditions of life in prison camps. His works are hard to read because the characters come from different countries: Ukraine, Kazakhstan, Poland, Estonia, Mongolia, only to name a few, and speak with different accents. His novels are also often set away from major cities, since prison camps were mostly situated in purloined regions like Siberia or Kazakhstan. The Solzhenitsyn that I find friendlier is quote, The Cancer Ward quote, whose writing style resembles more to 19th century realism. Set in a faraway clinic, Solzhenitsyn depicts the patients as individuals with insightful opinion and worldview despite their lack of education. At this point, you might be wondering, what about Dostoevsky? Why isn't he mentioned? All I can say is that back then, I had already heard that his books were very difficult to understand, so when I wrote this text, I still didn't have the courage to read his books. I read them not long after this text. But by now, I can't remember them very clearly, so I'm unable to give a fair evaluation. I'll just say a few words. In his books, I saw some pitiful people who didn't want to do immoral things and who wished to live simple lives, but the environment around them forced them to go against their morals.